Okay, welcome. I think we're ready to start our session 2, the current campus crisis, what went wrong. Our questions that we're going to be talking about on our panel today are, what do you see as the immediate cause of the current campus crisis? To what degree is it the result of larger intellectual, cultural, and/or academic trends in the past generation? And to what degree is campus anti-Semitism a problem of elite universities? So we'll each speak for a bit, and we'll be taking audience questions later, so feel free to write those whenever they occur to you. And Susie, I think you'll start us out.
Thank you for inviting me here. I want to begin by pushing back a bit on the title of this conference. I do not think that we are witnessing the end of significant Jewish participation at elite universities. I'm quite confident that next year and in 5 or 10 years, there will be substantial numbers of Jewish students and Jewish faculty at elite universities, and that they will find ways to flourish. I am aware of the fact that conditions for Jewish students have changed. Recently, I gave a talk at Yale, and afterwards, a young woman came up to speak to me. She was a PhD student in Slavic studies, and she was almost trembling as she spoke. She was Israeli. Her parents had emigrated from Ukraine, where she still had family members. Talk about someone in the crosshairs of history. And she told me that starting precisely on October 8th, her professors literally stopped speaking to her. She said that the past 17 months had been traumatic for her and her Israeli friends on campus, all of whom were treated as pariahs. I was shocked and horrified to hear this. This was Yale University, and I'm sure that her professors considered themselves to be good people with good, progressive, even anti-racist values. So I do not minimize what is happening on campus. Still, I fear that we may be generating a bit of a moral panic when it comes to the topic of Jews and the universities. And moral panics always lead to bad political decisions, as when recently the Anti-Defamation League hastily praised President Trump's executive order that ostensibly targets anti-Semitism, and when it supported, though later retracted, the deportation of foreign students. It behooves us to remember that for centuries, we Jews have often been identified as aliens, subversive aliens, targeted for expulsion. These are undeniably stressful times, but we need to stay true to our values. I believe that what we are witnessing today are 2 crises of delegitimacy. The first, coming from the activist left, is the discrediting of Zionism, that is, of a state for the Jewish people, regardless of its government, its policies, or its borders. The second crisis originates from the government, that is, Trump's attack on the values and the very function of our institutions of higher education. The first crisis has several roots, and it originates from both within Israel and entirely outside of it. For today's young people, the only Israel they know is the Israel of the occupation. It is the Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu, of corruption, demagoguery, and racism, of the lack of any future for Palestinian sovereignty, and of an increasingly messianic, violent settler movement that terrorizes Palestinians in the West Bank with complete impunity. I do not think we should sugarcoat any of this. But the left's hostility to Zionism predates all that, indeed predates the state of Israel itself. And that hostility flourishes in an ideological realm entirely divorced from actual political realities. In this view, self-determination for the Jewish people is in itself an oppressive, supremacist, inherently nefarious enterprise. Since October 7th, we have seen the vilification of Zionism and of Zionists, which seems to mean anyone who will not take a virtual loyalty oath disavowing the Jewish state, on college campuses as well as in the cultural and literary realms. I believe the ground for all this was prepared by the BDS movement, which for the past 2 decades has done so much to establish the view of Israel as a settler, colonial, racist, imperialist, fascist enterprise. Since October 7th, groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, along with collaborating faculty members, have normalized an obsessive, unhinged hatred of Israel and a glorification of its enemies. As the inaptly named Jewish Voice for Peace declared, quote, "Death to Israel is not just a threat, it is a moral imperative and the only acceptable solution," end quote. I suspect that many of the students protesting the Gaza war did not adhere to such politics. I am sure that many were simply horrified by the enormous carnage and the war crimes in Gaza, something that, again, I don't think we should whitewash. But the protests were led and organized by groups with openly eliminationist politics. QAD, the activist group at Columbia, is among the most insane, something the New York Times' coverage has largely ignored. QAD defines itself as, quote, "fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization," end quote, and it has effusively praised the October 7th atrocities. Most recently, it renamed the university after a Palestinian terrorist and vandalized the reading room at Butler Library with slogans such as, quote, "the university will burn for the martyrs," end quote. These Lilliputian revolutionaries perfectly epitomize what the writer and Auschwitz survivor John Amaray called virtuous anti-Semitism. That is, the belief that somehow the world will become a more just place, perhaps even a perfect place, if only the state of Israel can be abolished. Amaray coined this phrase in the 1970s in response to the anti-Zionism of the European New Left, but it is unfortunately still apt. And frankly, I'm tired of the Talmudic debates about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Calling for the annihilation of a nation, which happens to be the only place in the world where Jews are a majority, is calling for the death of Jews. Label it anti-Semitism or not, it doesn't really matter. I wish I could say I know how to begin to turn around the debate in the universities over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to ground it in actual politics and actual history rather than fantasy, to analyze it in all its complexity and, frankly, in all its tragedy. But I have no simple answer to that, other than to keep writing, speaking, and teaching. A fundamental change in the political situation and the political leadership among both Israelis and Palestinians would help. But frankly, at the moment, that feels terribly far away. The other crisis is the one launched by Trump, and that is, in my view, the more dangerous one. He has unleashed his attacks on the universities under the fig leaf of fighting anti-Semitism, about which he cares and understands nothing. If you think that Trump is responding genuinely to anti-Semitism or to wokeness on college campuses, I would strongly urge you to think again. Trump's unprecedented assault on the universities cannot be separated from his unprecedented assault on law firms, press organizations, judges, civil servants, government agencies, due process, and the Constitution itself. He aims for nothing less than the destruction of any institutions that function independently of his control. Trump does not dream of a world devoid of anti-Semitism. He dreams of a world in which Donald Trump will have unfettered power. But a democracy is defined precisely by the existence and flourishing of institutions outside of government, and certainly outside of presidential control. Countries in which the government dictates to the universities and punishes them are not generally happy places. Think of the Ayatollah's Iran, of Putin's Russia, of Erdogan's Turkey, of el-Sisi's Egypt, of Orban's Hungary. Needless to say, none of these places are good for Jews. The objects of Trump's scorn, the rule of law, the fostering of higher education, academic freedom, scientific inquiry, the protection of minorities, all have been very good for American Jews. Indeed, all have been crucial to our flourishing and our survival. History, in Weimar Germany, in the Soviet Union, in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere, has taught us that attacks on the intelligentsia, on journalists, on professors, on scientists, on all those who produce knowledge, always end up as attacks on Jews. To enable the Trumpian project or to normalize it is to make a Faustian bargain that we Jews will come to regret. I will close with some words from a Purim sermon by Rabbi Sharon Bruce of Los Angeles entitled, "I Am Not Your Pawn." The rabbi observed, quote, "For 17 months, universities have fallen into a moral quagmire of their own making. For 17 months, my kid and her Jewish friends have been gaslit by well-intentioned people whose worldview seems to be dependent on minimizing or denying the reality of anti-Semitism in the university because it clashes with their worldview and with a hierarchy of suffering," end quote. But then she turned to the Trump administration's actions, especially its massive defunding of billions of dollars for medical research under the aegis, bizarrely I might add, that this will somehow protect Jews. "No," Rabbi Bruce said, quote, "I am not heartened by the president's actions. Our saviors have not arrived. These actions themselves constitute a form of anti-Semitism. We, the Jews, are being used to advance a political agenda that will cause grave harm to the social fabric and to the institutions that are best suited to protect Jews and all minorities. Our pain, our trauma, is being exploited to eviscerate the dream of a multiracial democracy," end quote. To which I say, amen. I will conclude by noting that this is a dark and confusing time. A kind of radically simplistic, Manichaean thinking has dominated much of the discourse since October 7th, especially on the left. A number of books about Israel and Gaza by presumed public intellectuals, Peter Beinart, Enzo Traverso, Pankaj Mishra, are unfortunate examples of this. What is needed at the moment is the opposite of binary analyses when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need complex thinking, dialectical thinking, new and original thinking. We need the ability to wrestle with doubt, contradiction, and failure. We need the ability to ask questions to which we don't have all the answers. I think the greatest gift we can give to Jewish students and to all students is to open up spaces of true intellectual freedom where such thinking can begin to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. We'll move on to Jamie now.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the center for hosting us. Thank you to Marty, who was my first boss out of college at the New Republic. And Marty and Leon and Jeff and Paul, I feel really gave me the sort of graduate education that I did not ever have. So I'm really honored to be in their presence today. I think that there are structural and intellectual reasons for what's been going on our campuses over the past 20 years. I say 20 years because that's when I started studying. I entered Yale in the fall of 2002, and I graduated in the spring of 2006. And just to give you an example of something that I think can sort of illustrate how dramatically things have changed in that period. So I was at Yale during a very heady time in America. It was the run-up to the Iraq War, it was during the Iraq War, it was the aftermath of the Iraq War, a very politically disputatious time, certainly on campus, lots of protests, lots of controversy. In addition to that, while I was at Yale, we had major strikes by the unions, by the Graduate Student Union and the Dining Hall Workers Union, 3 out of the 4 years that I was there. It was also a very contentious time. And I don't recall there ever being an episode when I was at Yale where a speaker was shouted down, where an event had to be canceled. And we had some very controversial speakers. Daniel Pipes spoke when I was at Yale. There were certainly protests. There were people who got up during his talk and made their views known, and they, were taken out non-violently, but the speech went on. And so that didn't happen. These bad things that you see on campuses didn't happen. So fast forward 9 years after I graduate, it's 2015, and there's a sort of infamous affair that occurred at Yale that fall called the Christakis affair, which some of you might be familiar with. It involved a professor who was also what used to be known as the master of a particular residential college. Of course, we can't use that word master anymore to describe educational leaders. They haven't yet gotten rid of the master's degree, although I'm sure that's next on the sort of Orwellian list that they have. So the wife of the master of a particular college wrote an email to her students on the eve of Halloween, basically explaining to them that, you're adults, you can wear whatever Halloween costumes you want. If someone wears a costume that offends you, then you should be able to talk to them about it and explain these things without coming to the university administration and trying to get, the administration involved in whatever kind of arguments you have about Halloween costumes. The only reason she wrote this, by the way, was because an administrator at Yale sent an email to the entire school with literal pictures of people dressed up as a sombrero, in an Indian headdress, like extremely crude, Halloween costumes, which, by the way, no one had ever worn at Yale before. Basically instructing students that you should not wear these Halloween costumes. Okay, so she sends this email. And you can go look it up online. It's still there. A mob of students circled her husband, who's a very distinguished professor, Nicholas Christakis, for about 3 hours in the quad, screaming reprehensible things that I cannot repeat in this room to his face for hours on end about Halloween costumes. Okay, and I watched that, and I felt like my world was coming apart because I did not recognize that university. It was a completely different world. And, there are reasons for this that maybe, Jonathan Haidt might be able to explain to you, or Steven Pinker, who's speaking later, I'm sure, can get into the reasons why that period of time, between 2006, 2008, the Obama election, and 2015, things went so downhill in terms of the discourse on campus. But something happened. And what I learned over time was that in the years that I left Yale, the number of administrators at Yale University has grown 3 times as fast as the number of students, such that today, the ratio between students and administrators is 1-to-1. Okay? There's an administrator for every undergraduate student at Yale. And so what do these administrators do? They have to justify their existence, right? So they come up with all these, phantom problems that don't exist, right? That there's massive, widespread racism at universities, which, by the way, there is, but it's against Asians, okay? Not the groups that they purport that there's racism against, and Jews, of course. All these, there's homophobia and there's transphobia and all these sort of invented phobias and fears that on university campuses are probably the most hospitable places, by the way, to LGBT people and to racial minorities, especially the Ivy League ones. So I think that the injection of the administration, the involvement of administrators in the day-to-day lives of students, going beyond their role as just administrators and actually getting involved into sort of, content issues, the curriculum issues, getting in between students who should be figuring out things themselves, because that's what you do at a university, is you supposedly grow up. So I think that's something that isn't specifically about anti-Semitism, but I think it's definitely, it's this sort of undergirding phenomenon to a lot of what's wrong with our universities. Yes, sorry. So that's the sort of structural rot that needs to be fixed. Now, as to the second one, the intellectual problem, I also see that more as a symptom of broader and deeper intellectual trends that have been going on in American intellectual life and in the universities really since the late 1960s. And again, this isn't specifically anti-Semitism. I don't think most of these students are waking up thinking, I want to hurt the Jews, or I want to make life difficult for Jewish students. It's Israel is a settler colonialist society. It is the new South Africa. It is the new apartheid pariah state, and we're going to make an enemy out of this state. And many of them don't even understand the history. They don't understand the attachment that the vast majority of Jews around the world have to this state. They have been taught, or they've been socialized into believing that this country is the apotheosis of evil. Now, certainly, are there professors who are anti-Semitic? Yes, and I actually blame the professors not only for most of the problems involved on the university campuses, I blame them for a lot of the problems in the country, frankly. And I do. And this is not to defend what the Trump administration is doing by any means. But we should understand that for too long, the professoriate in this country has behaved in ways and done things and alienated the vast majority of Americans from higher education. Long before October 7th, if you looked at the polls, the support among the American public for higher education was going on a precipitous decline. Okay, and that exists long before this Israel issue became a huge issue. And it used to be in America that we used to look up to our elite Ivy League presidents. Like, they were known national figures. Like, the president of Yale would come out and say something about a major issue, and it would be on the front page of the New York Times, okay? Now, university presidents have mostly become fundraisers and administrators, and they don't serve that role anymore. That's also something, again, that goes back to the structural problem of the university, is that they're not really involved in, or they don't really see their roles anymore as, teaching and preparing our future generations to love and cherish a liberal democracy. It's more about being, the world's largest NGO, as someone in the last panel said, or was it Rabbi Wolpe said that. And so I think that the place of the university in American life has unfortunately moved in a bad direction, and you see that even further with the injection of massive amounts of money from foreign dictatorships, okay? And it's not just Qatar, it's China. Particularly at Yale, it's been China for many years, and I think that's also a very distressing development. I think do I have like 1 minute left or 2 minutes left? There's something else I want to talk about briefly, because I have a sort of personal attachment to this and concern about this. It's the rise of queer theory and the radical transgender movement. And I think the popularity that this has been, particularly among young people, and sort of accepting and just really our sense-making institutions, the adoption of an ideology that would tell you something that is completely false, which is that men can become women and women can become men, and that biological sex doesn't exist, and that gender triumphs biological sex. And I think that a society that will believe something like that will believe anything, and I think that and you have to understand this queer theory thing. It obsesses over marginalization, and it's basically, we have an ideology. You've heard of this term, intersectionality. What does that really mean? It means an accumulation of quote-unquote marginalized identities make you a more virtuous and noble person, right? So I say this as a gay man. It used to be that if you were gay, that was sort of, interesting, and that kind of puts you in a bohemian place, and that was, maybe you were discriminated against. Maybe we have to talk to you about what it means to be the victim of prejudice. That is no longer the case anymore, okay? A gay white man is so passé. Now you have to be Now you have to be a queer, transgender, non-binary, just add up the titles, add up the list of things. And I think that, oddly, this is the paradox, is that the crazier those people are, the more anti-Israel they are, which is such a paradox, right? Because the more letters you add on to your identity, the higher the building they will put you on in Gaza City to throw you off. And I think that just really, it just demonstrates the utter irrationality of this movement that we have to contend with. It is, I don't know if that's anti-Semitism. I'm sure there's anti-Semitism has to be involved in it to some degree, but it's something much deeper and something much more disturbing and sicker, frankly. But thank you.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I guess I'm speaking as someone who also attended Yale and Harvard during what I think we refer to now as the golden era of Jews at Ivy League universities, at a time when, I think we used to say anti-Semitism was really just a subject we learned about in history, and none of us could think of times when we had experienced it or encountered it on campus, really. And now, as someone whose academic career has been at the University of Florida since 2017, where at UF we are sort of ahead of the curve. We've been kind of in Trump's world since before Trump 2.0. So in spring of 2023, before October 7th. The Senate Bill 266 was passed, and that brought us into this era of repression and fear on campus that many people have compared to the McCarthy era. And this bill has restricted public universities from using funds from the federal and state government for DEI projects and activities. It has impacted our hiring, and it has restricted what can be taught in core gen ed classes, so that even a class of mine on post-Holocaust American Jews was reviewed by this curriculum committee, and because I was lucky enough to have this NEH fellowship here this year, my husband was, who's also a religion and Jewish studies professor, was preparing to teach this course for me, and he had heard from this committee that was reviewing this class on post-Holocaust American Jews, and they noticed language in the course objectives that this course would be teaching students about Jews' shifting relationship to the majority American culture as a result of the Holocaust. And that language of minority and majority caught the attention of this curriculum, and they emailed my husband to ask him about it, and he did explain that, yes, this is a class about the Holocaust, and so we will be learning about persecution and about minority and minority groups. And they backed down after that, which suggested to me that we in Jewish studies are probably a bit more protected and privileged. I know from my colleagues in gender studies, in African American studies, that they've really had to change what they're teaching. Most of my colleagues in Jewish studies and religion, we've changed the language as we've been told to because of this new Senate bill, but we mostly in Jewish studies are able to continue teaching much of what we do. So UF and Florida in general has been held up as a model, I think, in this administration for what the president, what Republicans want to happen in universities, and it has been scary and has impacted academic freedom at our university. And thinking about our questions about what are the causes of our current crisis, the title and the question left vague what the crisis is. From the perspective of UF, it does not feel like we're in a crisis for Jews at our university. UF continues to be a very comfortable place for Jewish students. We have the largest number of Jewish undergraduates. We're also, just as a reminder in terms of numbers, larger undergraduate population than Harvard and Columbia combined. So in terms of what is happening at the Ivy League, is it similar to what is happening at other universities? I think it's very regional. I wouldn't even say private and public. What's happening at the University of California schools is quite different than what's happening in Florida or at Michigan or at Wisconsin. But as many of us have read in the news, the South seems to be having a different experience, and I think that is partly because we have so many conservative Christian students, so that even if as a professor some of your views and maybe your liberal views, your liberal politics come out, our students do speak up, and you hear about it in teaching evaluations. But to go back to the question about what's impacted the crisis, so for me it's not about Jews having a bad experience at UF, because that doesn't seem to be the case, but this crisis of democracy, this crisis that is happening in our country, which includes a very changed relationship between government and universities. It used to be a very symbiotic relationship where the government was a kind of wonderful patron and gave these funds to universities with the understanding that they would be doing research that would help make our citizens more healthy, more informed scientific research. And the relationship has changed to one that's, sees the universities as a battleground. That is the language that our Governor DeSantis uses and Republican politicians. And so there's not trust there anymore. So the crisis that I see is really about democracy, about the principles of democracy, freedom of speech, which is one of the things that universities depend on, in addition to this more supportive relationship from the government, which we no longer have. And I think we can go to Eli now.
Thank you so much to the center. So I want to start my remarks by recalling one of my favorite anecdotes, my favorite bits of Paul Rudd's memoir. He is, of course, the Weather Underground. Mark Rudd. I'm so sorry about that. Forgive me. I need more coffee. So Paul Rudd is, of course, the famous Weather Underground figure, and also was a student at Columbia. Mark Rudd. I know. Did I say Paul again? Oh, again. Forgive me. I'm thinking of Paul Berman because I'm looking at him right now, and he knew, of course, Mark Rudd. All right. Anyway, so Mark Rudd, forgive me, just takes over Hamilton Hall in '68 at the height of all of the chaos. One of the first things he does after he's in the president's office is he makes a phone call to his father in New Jersey, and he says, "Dad, we just took over a building. What do you think?" His father responds, "Well, you should give it back." And I tell this story because there's a real contrast between the original sort of student disruptions that were about the Vietnam War, but of course also more things at Columbia, including the expansion of the campus into the primarily black neighborhood, that there was real skin in the game for the students some 60 years ago, meaning they were arrested. Many were expelled. There were consequences for their civil disobedience. We can debate the merits of their civil disobedience, but the point is that it was not a risk-free proposition. So let's now fast forward to a graduate student that became briefly famous named Joanna Slutsky, who was the representative of the people who had taken over Hamilton Hall in 2024. She gave a press conference and she accused the administration of a war crime of trying to starve the people who had just taken over a building because they couldn't use their cafeteria cards to bring in food, and therefore they were literally trying to starve the students. And that, I think, really is a small example that illuminates the whole, which is to say that until probably this semester, or maybe the fall semester of this year, we started to see it. On these elite campuses, there was no consequence for shouting down speakers. There was no consequence for conducting loud demonstrations in front of Israeli history classrooms. There was no consequence for taking over the quad and then declaring it to be a Zionist-free zone. There was no consequence if your organization was at first, like Students for Justice in Palestine, was seen to be over the top, and Jewish Voices for Peace, they just reformed as a new group called QAD. There's no consequence for disgusting posters at Columbia and other places that depicted Israel and Netanyahu in almost like Nazi-esque kind of caricature. No consequences whatsoever. And it's even worse than that, because the slightest microaggression against any other group on those campuses, gay, trans, black, any other group, was punished with severity. So if you want to know, if we're talking about defining what is the crisis on elite campuses, I would say it's that. It's that you have an incredibly restrictive set of rules that impinge upon the expression of students and professors that comes to every other group except for the Jews. And I think that that puts Jewish students in a difficult position. Because on the one hand, we are Americans. We deserve, if those are the rules, why aren't the rules applying to us? And that is, I think, the right thing to do in a way. On the other hand, somebody who has a problem with all the many restrictions on speech on campus, is it in the best interest of Jewish students to try to get recognition in the hierarchy of the oppressed, the hierarchy and so forth of minorities? And I actually don't think it is. So how do you navigate that? How do you sort of say, we demand to be treated equally, and at the same time, we don't want to be part of this oppressor-oppressed sort of dichotomy? We don't, and I don't know the answer to that, but I think that that's the way to think about the problem. And then I want to address, I think I agree that there is a lot that I don't like about the Trump administration's response. But I do think it's worth adding a little bit of context. When the Obama administration issued letters to campuses basically telling them, their education department telling them that they had to rewrite the due process rules for people accused of sexual harassment or sexual assault, that was also a form of having the federal government trying to impose a sort of new system and set of values that did affect speech to a certain extent inside the universities. But in that case, I would argue that the government was pushing on a bit of an open door. In this particular case, I kind of agree with some of the values. I don't like antisemitism. I think there needs to be more real diversity, intellectual diversity on campus. But the way that it's being done, by threatening to hold up federal funding, I do think presents an awful kind of precedent, particularly since I don't expect Republicans to be in power for the next 1,000 years. And if that is a precedent that a Democratic administration would use. And I have written in my own columns for the Free Press that I absolutely despise most of what Mahmoud Khalil has to say as the leader of one of the leaders of the QAD, but you can't just assert that you can deport him without telling us the actual crime that he's violated. He is a permanent resident. He has a green card. So I do think that it is important to make those kinds of distinctions. And I worry a little bit that the Jewish community, and I think that Trump in a weird way encourages this, it kind of almost has a similar kind of relationship that they did with friendly czars during the Romanov dynasty. Meaning that you need to have this sort of very powerful figure coming in to be our protector. And that to me is a kind of, that is a diaspora life that I would like to leave in history. And so in that respect, I do think that there is a kind of troubling dynamic between the Jewish community. Far better for the I think the Justice Department should enforce Title VI consistently when there are credible claims, and there are, against universities for failing to take action that they're required to by law. Then it is okay for the Education Department, as far as I'm concerned, to work with those universities, and if need be, even take legal action. But this kind of approach, which is actually dealing with far more than anti-Semitism, is too much. So I kind of, I'm trying to. But finally, I think that maybe the most damage of all of that is that there was already a lot of momentum that was built up after October 7th. There was a reaction. Because, to address an earlier comment, yes, the war is horrible. Israel is not perfect. There's plenty to criticize, I suppose, in the response in Gaza. That is all fair game. But this movement was organized before Israel did anything. That is the kind of amazing thing about it, is that you saw these letters sent on campus from pro-Palestinian groups before Israel even responded to the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And that is a kind of sickness. So we were asking, what are the causes of the current crisis? And I think we should maybe deal with this I would sort of say, first of all, I think the students knew there would be no consequences for disrupting daily life. That's a big one. The second is what was been discussed before, which is a long fuse of Saidism or anti-Orientalism on campus that led to a kind of purging of pro-Israel professors in Middle East studies, but also a broader kind of you need to sign, take the loyalty oath against Israel or something. There's a lot of foreign funding. And I also think that social media, and TikTok in particular, has radicalized lots of young people, not just on campus. So we should avoid monocausality. But I think a big one is introducing consequences to students who do that kind of thing. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Okay. We're going to collect your questions, so if you can pass them to the folks on the aisle. And I don't know if we wanted to respond to each other at all, or about these causes, and what the crisis is.
Well, if I could say something about free speech. You mentioned disgusting posters of Netanyahu. I'm pretty much of a free speech absolutist. I think people have a right to show disgusting posters of Netanyahu. I think people have a right, as happened at Berkeley, to raise a sign that says Israel deserves 10,000 October 7th. I believe that people have a right, as happened at Barnard ludicrously, to distribute leaflets from the Hamas media office. I think that we are in dangerous territory when we don't distinguish between speech and actions. I do not think that you have a right to take over and deface buildings. I do not think you have a right to take over the campus commons. I do not think you have the right to restrict Jewish students from activities or to physically intimidate them. But I'm really, really wary of us not distinguishing between speech and action.
I agree.
There's been a lot of disgusting speech, but we need to be very, very wary, I think, of looking for, quote, protections from speech. Speech and actions are different, and it's actions that are the problem, not speech.
I agree. However, speech is punished on campus for all of these other groups. So my point is not to say that, yes, we need to punish speech. I agree with you 100%. I'm a free speech absolutist as well. But if the rules are rigged against Jews, that itself is a problem.
Right. So, Eli, the solution to this is not to rig the rules so that the Jews are part of the rigged rules.
I agree.
The rules are the way to resolve this is to change the rules, which means get rid of DEI and fire all the DEI administrators. That's the solution to this.
Yeah, but I agree, but I have some empathy for some of the younger Jewish student activists pushing back because they're dealing with the system as it is. This is what they know. This is This is used to
It's good to call out the hypocrisy, but the job is not to then say, we want the Jews to be added to this protected group of people.
We're all in vigorous agreement that it's a problem, but it's like when I see the pro-Palestinian side wrap themselves in the First Amendment and the idea of free speech, I just want to say bullshit. Because these people are the same people who don't care at all about free speech when someone's voicing something.
During the 1950s, what did we have? We had a bunch of communists
Yep.
who were saying that they were communists, who were saying that, or fellow travelers, who were saying that they were being unjustly persecuted because of their political beliefs and expression, which was true. The fact that they supported a system that would have obliterated all individual rights to free speech does not mean that they don't get to have the same rights as everybody else. So I agree with you. They're total hypocrites. They're total charlatans, but they still have rights.
Okay, yeah, I just think you should say both. Like, you have free speech and you don't believe in it.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Can I add one point to this?
Yeah,
This
go
is,
ahead, Jamie.
as I'm sure many of you know, this event has been protested by a group of scholars who've written an open letter. They're very upset that Bill Ackman hasn't been invited to speak here. And I think, this is very much in the spirit of what we're hearing, what we're talking about. I think whatever you think of Bill Ackman, he's clearly a very influential player in this issue. And I also have no doubt that Leon and Deborah Lipstadt will, they're not going to pull any punches. Let's just say that. So.
One of our questions, the person wrote, my parents met at Brandeis. That was the only place that would take them. They speak so fondly of it. Would it make sense to have a Jewish college again? I have a nephew who goes to Brandeis. I hear from many high school students who are interested in it. It does feel like it is still a place that many Jews feel will be comfortable for them in their religious practice. But we're also at a time when we don't have to deal with quotas anymore, and I guess I agree with those who feel that I hope Jews won't leave the other spaces too. I want that there will be Jewish faculty and students at the elite universities
We
and at
know
our
from the
public
Supreme Court
universities.
case that there are quotas for Asian students.
For
Asian students at elite universities. We're living in a quota era right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, the question was about Jewish students.
Yeah, okay.
So this question about should there be a Jewish college again? Anyone have thoughts about
Brandeis,
this?
like 25 years ago, hired Angela Davis. So, how committed is Brandeis to the Jewish people? I don't know.
Yeah, if I could just say something also, it's not really in relation to this question, but universities now are very, very different than when I went there and when many people went there. And what I mean by that is that universities are now, quote, quite international. There are enormous numbers of Chinese students. There are enormous numbers of South Asian students, of East Asian students, of students from India. I have students from Pakistan and Turkey and all over the world. And it's a really different student body. It's not just the Goyim and the Jews. And the African Americans. It's just a very, very different student body. And I think we have to be aware of that. And that also really changes the politics of the campus. Students are coming from places with very, very different political histories, political ideas, political experiences. I have many students whose parents have received political asylum here. And we have to really, I think that we as professors anyway have to really respond to that, and with some humility and some respect. It's a very, very different campus, and I think to just think of it in terms of Jews and non-Jews is really missing a lot of what's going on campuses today.
There's also a question about student visas. Student visas are a contract stipulating that foreign students are granted a visa foreign students who are granted a visa are to refrain from protests or agitating in the host country. Why don't the universities just follow the law and expel them? Whether they are deported or not is not the concern or business of the university.
Foreign citizens have the right to protest here.
Yeah.
What they don't have the right to do is break the law. So if they're just out there demonstrating, peacefully, holding up a sign or chanting slogans, doesn't matter if I like them or not, that's legally protected speech. If they are involved in taking over campus buildings, defacing property, harassing individual students or professors, then not only should they be expelled, they should be deported.
I mean, some of this is a question of vetting. If you look into Mahmoud Khalil, you're like, well, why did Columbia want him? He worked for UNRWA. He was, it was unclear like where he was really from. And I hate to say this, but I think the things that make us uncomfortable about foreign students who participated in Quad and some of the extreme protests are exemplify precisely the kinds of behavior that the universities wanted. So if you're talking about the student visa question, I think it's got to start the process earlier. What's wrong with the admission process in these places? I think they wanted Khalil.
And that also that's not just foreign students. That's the American students that they're bringing in. Okay, we have a serious problem of political bias in the undergraduate admissions policies of these universities. The more social justice activities you lard onto your CV when you're applying, the better chance you have of getting into one of these schools. And they're certainly not going to give the founder of a pro-life club at high school, they're not going to give that student the same sort of preference or legitimacy that they would give one who started a pro-choice group or a LGBT group. Now, these are private universities. They can decide what they want to do, although they do receive federal funding and they have to obey, federal laws. But I think we also have to look at the admissions offices and the admissions policies beyond just the racial quotas that have been ruled on by the Supreme Court.
So again, I would be very, very wary of vetting foreign students for their politics. I think that that's a nefarious and grotesque road to go on. And as we heard from Rebecca, it used to be Jewish students who were vetted for their socialist politics and kept out for that. We don't want to keep foreign students out based on their politics. This is a terrible, terrible road for us to go down.
Another question is about what.
That's assuming that there's neutrality in the process. I think that students already are vetted for their politics, as Jamie said. I mean, I agree in principle. You shouldn't be vetted for your politics. Ideally, the admissions people should want to make a rich, diverse mix of views on the campus, just like we'd like that to be the faculty. But we know the reality is that's not the case. So again, it's like, we're in the crisis now.
I guess it doesn't seem like the current administration is in favor of this kind of democratic pluralism that has been so central to universities. I guess the critique we heard here in Florida is that faculty have been teaching students not how to think, but what to think. But it seems like what we are getting from the government is they are telling us in a very minute way in terms of which words we can use and which words we shouldn't, what we should teach. So they're supposedly against this indoctrination, but it seems like they are asking us to do that in their direction. Another question that we have is about what practices and potentially voluntary constraints on speech must be exercised by faculty to ensure the academic freedom of students in their classes. Given faculty power, the dominance. Oh, okay. So anyway, what practices should the faculty be exercising to ensure this kind of academic freedom?
The First Amendment, I think, is a pretty good guide. and which means that students can write and say what they please as long as it's not inciting imminent lawless action, right? So, as much as I hate to admit it, the university presidents who were grilled by Congress in December 2023, when they were asked, is it okay, does it violate university policies for someone to stand out on the quad and say, kill all the Jews? That is protected speech, okay? By the First Amendment, that is protected speech. What made it problematic in that context was, of course, that if it had been any other group whose mass death was being called for, the university presidents would not have given that sort of lawyerly response that they did when it came to the Jews, okay? So they're being hypocrites. They're being hypocrites, and we should have a equal standard, right? Which means that you can get on the quad and say you want any group of people to be killed, okay? Not just certain groups should be protected. But I think these universities hold themselves up by the First Amendment. They voluntarily do that, particularly the elite schools. And like Susie, I'm a First Amendment, absolutist, and I think that it should apply to universities as well.
Yeah. It's like the reality versus the ideal at this point. I'm not saying that you should, you have a right to say, destroy Israel, you have a right to say whatever you want, but we know that it's not just what the university will punish formally, it's the entire atmosphere on campus makes a whole bunch of things unsayable, and this one horrible thing, not only sayable, but encouraged. And I don't know, I don't know that there's a quick fix to that. I don't think it's going to work the way that the Trump administration is going about it for sure. But I do think we have to acknowledge the reality that that's the world we're living in now on these campuses.
We were also asked about any opinions of Project Esther, which I admit I only read quickly this morning. Anyone want to explain this? I don't think I remember the details to.
I don't know what Project Esther is.
There's a big article in the New York Times about this today. It's a sort of, it's a plan that was sort of hatched by the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, to, in the words of the New York Times, so take that as you will, to end pro-Palestinian activism in America, essentially, through using the courts, through using other political means to basically go after pro-Palestinian activists, mostly on university campuses, with so many lawsuits trying to allege that they're tied to terrorist groups and whatnot. Again, if they are tied to terrorist groups, and I believe the Students for Justice in Palestine, if you go back in its history, it was connected to the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or something. I think that's true. If it's legal, then I don't see what the problem is. So I don't know, Eli, if you know more about this, but
I just say this: the way to combat a mature and effective Israel delegitimation movement and pro-Palestinian movement is to cultivate the very brave Gazans who, at great personal risk, have stood up and said, "No more Hamas," and faced the worst consequences. Bring them to campus and force these pikers, these frauds, to confront a real Gazan and say, who will ask them, "Why are you in solidarity with my oppressor?" That's the way that you discredit the movement. Not through more lawfare and not by aping and mimicking the practices of the left that drive me crazy when it is applied to other things.
Okay, I think we'll end there then.